Believe it or not, Kohls was a grocery store before it was a department store. Maxwell Kohl opened the first Kohls food store in 1946 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The 1950s saw rapid growth, and they also introduced the arched roof design that Kohls became known for. By the early 1960s, Maxwell Kohl had built the company into the largest chain of grocery stores in the Milwaukee area. And in 1962, Kohl decided to try his hand at a department store, which opened in Brookfield, Wisconsin. The department stores, which are very familiar today, would end up outlasting their grocery stores, with A&P buying the grocery division in 1982, and eventually closing the stores for good in 2003. Colonial Stores was for much of the 20th century one of the nation's largest supermarket chains. At its peak, the company had over 500 stores and operated in 11 states, from Florida to Maryland. David Pender founded the company in 1901 by opening his first grocery store in Norfolk, Virginia. The Colonial name would come in the mid-1940s, following the merger of Big Star and Little Star grocery stores. The company introduced their popular CS Rooster logo in 1947, as they were busy converting all of their stores into self-service. By the 1960s, they had returned to the Big Star name as a large discount operation, and by the 1970s, most of the Colonial outlets were either closed or converted over to Big Star. Big Star would survive until the early 1990s, when they too closed for good. Mars supermarkets were a family-owned fixture in the Baltimore, Maryland area that began in the mid-1940s. Joseph Deanna named his supermarket after a nearby airplane that could take off and land on water, called the Mars Flying Boat, which was developed by Glenn Martin. Joe ended up selling his shares of the business to his two younger brothers, and they would run it for over 50 years. At the peak, there were 13 stores around Maryland, which were maintained up until 2016. At that time, Mars sold 5 of its stores to Wise Markets and decided to close the remaining locations. Cost-cutting measures were tried, but in the end, Mars couldn't compete with the likes of Wegmans and Harris Teeter. In 1917, Albert and Hugh Gerard opened the first Alpha Beta store in Pomona, California. The name was in reference to how the shelves were stocked, alphabetically by product. Signs featuring the chain's smiling cowboy mascot, Alfie, became a common sight throughout California. By 1961, there were more than 100 stores. The company was then bought by American Stores in 1961, with Skaggs Drug Centers buying American Stores in 1979. The combined food and drug stores in Alpha Beta territory were rebranded as Skaggs Alpha Beta. Later in the 1980s, the company bought out the Jewel Companies, which owned Osco Drug, and some stores became Jewel Oscos. By 1994, the company merged with the Ralph's chain, and the Alpha Beta name disappeared altogether. Jitney Jungle was a chain that began in Jackson, Mississippi in 1919. The name Jitney comes from a slang term for a nickel, and initially it was called Jitney Jingle, but a local newspaper made a mistake and published an ad that called it Jitney Jungle, and the name stuck. The store was one of the first to offer the cash and carry model, rivaling Piggly Wiggly for the concept. Jitney Jungle would actually win a lawsuit that made its way to the Supreme Court and proved that Piggly Wiggly had not invented the idea of self-service. Jitney Jungle continued to grow, spreading to neighboring states and building a chain of more than 100 stores. At one time, it was the largest privately held grocery store chain in the United States. In the mid-1990s, the family would sell the company for $400 million, and by the end of the decade, it had become a debt-ridden company. Eventually, it was bought out by Winn-Dixie, and the remaining stores were rebranded. Brunos was founded in 1932 by Joe Bruno in Birmingham, Alabama. He opened an 800-square-foot corner grocery that grew slowly at first, but eventually it would launch a line of discount stores called Food World during the 1970s. By the early 1990s, Bruno's was one of the top 40 grocery chains in the United States, with more than 200 stores across the South. The chain suffered a tragic loss in 1991 when a plane crash killed their top executives and members of the Bruno family. The chain was then sold off, and it lost the personal touch that had kept it thriving. Stores began to close, and the company was shuffled around through buyouts. Bruno's supermarkets held out until 2009. That's when the company dissolved, and what was left became Bell Foods. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, better known as A&P, was started in 1859 by George Gilman. Although prepackaged tea was how it all started, A&P spread across the country with nearly 200 stores and a thriving mail-order business by the turn of the century. They were different and offered no frills, which meant lower prices. This led to an explosion of stores, and by 1930, there were 16,000 of them. A&P was America's largest grocer, but they primarily focused on urban cities. As Americans made their way out into the suburbs, A&P began its decline. By the end of the 1970s, there were roughly 1,500 stores remaining. By the 1980s, the company was profitable again, but just barely. By the early 2000s, they were back in the red, and bankruptcy was looming. And after 156 years, the final A&P closed in 2016. Born in Sicily, Dominick DiMatteo founded the Dominicks grocery chain in Chicago, Illinois in 1918. His second location opened up in 1934. By 1950, the DiMatteos were opening a 14,000 square foot supermarket and would reach 19 locations before they sold to Fisher Foods in 1968. The DiMatteo family wasn't out of the picture, and they continued to operate the stores with the backing of Fisher. Under Fisher, Dominicks grew to 45 locations, but the family wasn't happy with the agreement, so they bought it back for $100 million. The 1980s was spent experimenting with in-store pharmacies, cafes, and photo developing. By the early 1990s, Dominick DiMatteo Jr. had died and left the business to his kids, who did not have the same passion for the business. By 1998, Safeway owned the 116 Dominicks locations, and they would all but disappear over the next 15 years, officially closing in 2013. Dell Champs began in Mobile, Alabama in 1921 and was started by Alfred Dell Champs. By 1928, he was opening the largest supermarket in Alabama, and shortly after that, his company began to spread into Florida and surrounding states. Over 100 locations would eventually open, and by the 1980s, Dell Champs was experimenting with superstore concepts that were open 24 hours. In 1997, the chain of stores was purchased by Jitney Jungle, and 2 years later, they entered bankruptcy. By 2000, all locations with the Dell Champs name were closed. In 1961, a former Winn-Dixie executive named Frank Outlaw bought 4 grocery stores in Greenville, South Carolina, that he renamed BILO after he held a naming contest for the company. Outlaw's secretary came up with the name, and the stores began to open across Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. BILO became known for the bull statues that sat atop its stores. In 1977, BILO was sold to a Dutch food company and began merging other chains into the BILO brand. They held onto the company for over 30 years before they sold it in 2005. The chain struggled over the course of the next 10 years, filing and emerging from bankruptcy before finally merging with Winn-Dixie to become Southeastern Grocers. By 2021, the BILO name had been phased out completely. If you enjoyed this video, click on this playlist to watch even more. And as always, thank you so much for watching.